Let's talk about dropped frames, a pernicious problem that plagues pretty much every streamer at one point or another. Now, specifically, let's talk about what you can do in the moments where you're deep in a stream and suddenly chat's chiming in with, oh, slideshow, it's buffering, and, just throwing loading spinner images at you. Now, the only caveat to this tutorial is that I'll be speaking from the perspective of working with OBS. Now, the underlying issues that lead to dropped frames are the same, regardless of what broadcasting software you're using. But OBS, I find, provides some of the best tools to properly troubleshoot what's going on when you are dropping frames. So, let's jump over to OBS and take a look. So, the main tool that OBS provides you to do this troubleshooting is you can see right here this panel for stats. Now, slobs, for instance, that I worked with many years ago when I started streaming, just didn't have the same detail that let you troubleshoot effectively what's happening. Now, if you don't have this panel, it's easy to get. It's built into OBS. It just might not show up by default. To find it, you'll go up to the toolbar under Docs, and then you'll just make sure Stats is checked, and it'll add it into your docs, and then you have it there. Now, let's take a closer look at the stats page. Now, within the stats page, you can see just a tremendous amount of information for you, mostly around your connection and the process of your stream. So whenever you are streaming and you find yourself having some issues of dropped frames, stuttering, buffering, all of those issues that really usually stem from about the same concerns, this is where you're going to want to look first. Now, this is where some of the first sort of specifics come in that you may not be familiar with, because dropped frames is really a shorthand for several problems that are going on, not just one broad overarching issue. It's really just when most laymen use the term dropped frames, all they mean is that something has happened between you and the viewer, and that can be quite a few different things. So OBS splits it into three sort of logical sections, which I think is very helpful because each one kind of points to a different cause that you can then worry about if you can identify which is the one at fault. The frames missed due to rendering lag, skipped frames due to encoding lag, and then dropped frames due to network. Now, in the case that you are dropping frames, you'll see those first numbers going up. You see that all of mine are 0 out of something, and that's, well, because I'm not dropping frames right now. But what you'll see is those first numbers going up, and it'll show you the percentage of total there at the end of exactly how many frames you've dropped. So as you're dropping frames, you'll see that number grow. Just a large number doesn't necessarily indicate that you're actively dropping frames. It means that you have dropped a variety of frames over the course of the stream. Sometimes that can be normal, that you drop one frame here or there and that number just kind of grows. It's a small percentage of the overall frames, but maybe you see it by the end of stream, it's a few thousand. But if you've rendered a million frames, a few thousands, no big deal. So that's what to keep your eye out to identify when frames are in fact being dropped. So let's look at those in a little bit more detail and then give a couple examples of what you might want to do to fix that issue. So let's start at the top with frames missed due to rendering lag. Now, rendering lag is implying that you don't have enough GPU resources to actually render the frame prior to the next frame being requested to be rendered. So this is falling behind because your GPU simply doesn't have enough resources. Oftentimes what will lead to this is when you've started a new game. So a large spike in your GPU, resource use has come about and suddenly OBS is getting starved. So there's a couple primary things to do. First and foremost, actually, is to try disabling the preview in OBS. Now, I, like many others, kind of rely on the preview in order to observe how stream is going, right? You glance over there, you see what stream looks like. Unfortunately, however, there are times where I've seen OBS simply suddenly require a ridiculous amount of GPU resources to continue generating that preview. I don't know if it's like a VRAM leak or something like that. So that's a good place to at least try right at the outset to see if that just solves the problem. You'll be flying blind, but at least the stream can continue. Now, if that doesn't resolve things, your next stop is going to be limiting your GPU usage in your other tasks, like your game. And the primary way that you're going to want to be doing that is you need to ensure you have a frame limit on your games. By default, Windows will attempt to give a game, it typically takes priority, and it will give it all the GPU it needs to max its frame rate as much as possible. Now, if you're streaming, you're only going to be streaming at a max of 60 FPS. And so if your game is trying to generate 127 frames or whatever it can do, all of that's wasted effort, and it could be starving OBS. So you want to ensure that there's some kind of frame limit. There's like 3 ways to do that. There's a setting in a game to give it a specific frame limit. You can do it via your NVIDIA or AMD settings on your system to give an application a hard frame limit, or you can use VSync to tie it to what your monitor frame rate is. So those are your 3 main ones. Now, there's a lot more details that you can go into on, trying to limit how much GPU usage a game is using, but that's for a longer discussion. I'll touch on that later. But those are the main pieces that you can do with that. All right? Now, next up, let's talk about encoding lag. Now, if you're skipping frames due to encoding lag, that means that the actual encoder, your encoding settings in OBS, are demanding more resources than are available. Now, this one's a little bit complicated because it heavily depends on what your encoding settings are. If you're using x264, that means you're running out of CPU resources. If you are using an NVENC chip on an NVIDIA card, it means something is running out on your NVIDIA card, usually the VRAM. Similarly, if you're using an ARC card with their standalone chip, that would be similar to the NVENC. Now, in this case, your main sort of goal is going to just be to reduce the encoding burden that you're asking the chip to do. And there's a few ways to do that. Mostly, it's going to have to be changing your settings. So this one is a lot more difficult to do on the fly. And it's also likely, if it's in the middle of the stream that this comes up, it's likely due to whatever game or application you're trying to run using up the rest of the resources. Like suddenly your CPU spikes because you're playing something CPU intensive, or you're using up a bunch more of your VRAM in your GPU and your NVENC's getting starved. So in the case of the CPU, try to lessen that burden, change the settings. Your best bet for changing settings across the board are going to be to reduce your resolution and your frame rate. Those are going to be the main things that reduce the burden, as well as the quality presets. All of those will help lower the actual encoding burden to try to pull it into, low enough that whatever other applications you're running on your system are not maxing out your system. Now, finally, the last one of actual dropped frames due to network, well, that one's a little bit more challenging, and a lot of times there's not too much you can do at the moment, because those are going to be things that once your broadcast software tried to put it onto the network, it didn't make it wherever it was trying to go. Could be Wi-Fi issues, could be your internet service provider. It could be the ingest servers from whatever platform you're trying to stream to, Twitch, YouTube. And could, well, no, that would be it. If from your viewer's perspective, they're seeing, spinning and buffering, and you don't see any of these numbers going up, well, that's on them. Whatever their network's doing, that's not your problem. So there's really only a couple troubleshooting things that you can do in the moment here. Because if it's your network, there's not too much you can do aside from actually working on your network. And if it's your ISP, well, I guess you're going to get on the phone the next day and just deal with that. However, if it's the ingest servers, there are some things that you can do about it. For YouTube, I occasionally see dropped frames due to network with YouTube, and it's almost never my system or my network's fault. And so I actually just stop streaming and reconnect, and it's resolved. I don't know if it was just a shoddy connection, so sometimes it's worth a shot there. With Twitch, I've only really ever saw it once, but what happened was that the specific ingest server was just working very poorly, and so there's a setting in OBS to select which Twitch server you're going to. I don't have that handy because I'm connected to YouTube. But it's default, and it'll go to the closest one. But you can manually select which Twitch server you want to go to, and so you can try going to the next farthest one away from you, and you might get better results. It might up the delay by maybe a few milliseconds, but worth it if it keeps you from dropping frames. All right, let's summarize what we've covered. Now, when you start suffering from dropped frames, come into OBS and use the Stats panel to determine what part of your system is struggling, then try to reduce the strain on that part. GPU for rendering lag, CPU or GPU depending on your encoding settings for encoding lag, and then your network in the case of dropped frames. If you want more details on what you can do for each of these, I have an older, much longer video on this topic I streamed a couple years ago, which I'll link down in the description. If you found this helpful, please like and subscribe and let me know other topics or questions you'd like a tutorial on down in the comments. I'm always looking for what tutorials to make. Good luck out there.